Hi, welcome everyone. Over the past few days, people have been asking a lot in the comments for a comparison between PlayStation 2 emulators for Android, and now I'm bringing it to you. We looked at emulators like NetherSX2, ArmSX2, EmuCoreX, NetherSX2 with Turnip driver support, and PSX2. There are two emulators here that have paid versions, but all the versions we used were the free ones, obtained legally, straight from the project's GitHub, and as usual, I'll put everything on our Patreon blog so you guys can download from trustworthy sources. First, a word from our sponsors. If you want to buy original games while saving a lot, check out Instant Gaming, the digital store that sells games for various platforms, such as PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo Switch. Get games of all genres with discounts of up to 95%. You'll also find a variety of gift cards and credits for other services. You can pay for your order through your credit card on a website with a 4.7 rating on Trustpilot. You're buying games directly from Instant Gaming, not from other retailers. If you encounter any issues, Instant Gaming offers 24/7 support. What are you waiting for to save? Links in the description. Before showing the tests, I need to quickly go over the setup used. The device was a ROG Phone 6, with a Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1 and 8GB of RAM. The whole capture process was done through hardware, meaning a capture card connected directly to the PC, so there's no kind of performance loss from capture software. The games were loaded from a USB-C flash drive with a 550 MB per second read speed. All of them are using a 3x resolution scale, meaning running natively in full HD. I also used a Peltier cooler to keep the temperatures low. I'll leave the full setup in the description for anyone who wants to check it out. Let's start with an honorable mention for my PS2, an Eastern emulator I already covered in the past. Judging by the characters it's Korean or from another Asian country. Sorry about that, Asian viewers, but I can't tell the characters apart. It's been on the Play Store since launch, has few updates, and I'll go by the last test I did on it, where there were few options to customize the games. The resolution scale was pretty limited, the APIs were limited, and so on. It's the simplest emulator to set up and install on this list, but overall it only delivers half of what any other one here already delivers, so I'm automatically leaving it out, and it wasn't covered in this video. Now let's really get into our list, starting with the classic, jack of all trades, NetherSX2. Even though the last update was at the end of 2025, Nether still works really well overall. Let's briefly go over the project's origin. With the end of EtherSX2, some devs started making patches that, overall, improved compatibility with some games, added support for other controllers, and brought updates straight from PSX2, and that's how NetherSX2 came to be, since Ether's code was closed, and to this day nobody has managed to decompile the project or open up the code, it's still lost. But if we compare Nether to Ether, the results are already impressive. Looking at the games tested, even with heavier engines, like the Snowblind engine from Champions Return to Arms, which is still an issue on Android, we only saw a small performance dip that doesn't affect gameplay. Crash the Wrath of Cortex had the fog removed, or simply not rendered, so there's no issue there. But I'd rather they remove the fog than leave the game with low performance and unplayable, since this fog only shows up in the first level. One of the most demanding games for the console, God of War 2, runs well, with no visual issues and no FPS drops, even running in full HD. Gran Turismo 4, another game that's pretty graphically heavy for this system, also runs as expected, as much as possible. There are slight FPS drops during the start of the race, but overall the game runs really well after that. The only issue here is the other vehicle's lap times, which aren't displayed, but you'll see that this issue shows up in several other emulators too. Need for Speed Underground 2 also runs perfectly, with only small slowdowns during the start, but after that the gameplay flows normally. And Time Splitter's Future Perfect, which used to have slowdown issues and serious graphical problems, now runs as expected, though still not perfectly, since the light occlusion doesn't work perfectly, but overall the gameplay is smooth if you can ignore the lighting. Overall, NetherSX2, even without the latest updates, delivers great performance in most games and can be used as a go-to emulator in case you run into issues with others. Now a relatively new emulator, EmuCoreX, which showed up not too long ago. There are some paid features in this emulator, but from what it looks like, there's no function locked behind a paywall. It's more like a premium option for anyone who wants to support the developers, the same way PPSSPP Gold does. This emulator uses the same base as PSX2, and what sets it apart from official NetherSX2 is exactly the ability to use Turnip drivers for those with an Adreno GPU device. So let's talk exactly about that feature now. First, the emulator offers its own repository to download the driver. But here's the gameplay result I got with the recommended driver. Everything was broken, from the menus to the gameplay, everything flickering, objects rendered incorrectly, and overall performance was average or bad in some parts. So I decided to use my system's default driver, and that's when we got perfect gameplay, but the performance was still bad, with the game running at only 75% of full speed, still unplayable. As a last test, I picked the Turnip driver that works best for my device, Mr. Purple End of Life. And even so I only got 90% of the emulation's full speed, though with no visual issues. But playing like that would end up tiring me out. So, we're going to adopt the Mr. Purple EOL driver as the standard, since it had better graphical accuracy. If any game has a different issue, I'll use the system's default driver. The driver recommended by the emulator itself is already ruled out. Now the test with Crash the Wrath of Cortex. Unlike NetherSX2, here the fog renders normally, with small issues at the edges of objects touching the fog, which might be some chronic PlayStation 2 issue, but overall we get perfect gameplay, with every object rendered correctly and 100% speed. I also ran God of War 2 with the native driver. There was probably some issue loading the drivers that I didn't notice, but the gameplay is decent, though with some basic slowdown. Maybe using the optimized driver would fix that. And again we had driver issues in Gran Turismo 4. Using the Mr. Purple driver, all the car's reflections were completely broken. The speed is good, and unlike NetherSX2, the lap split times and car distances are displayed correctly. But to get perfect gameplay, I really had to use my device's default driver. With the native driver I got 100% gameplay speed, with the reflections rendering correctly at the same time. In Need for Speed Underground 2 we had another issue. At first the game was rendering correctly, and the speed was 100%. But as soon as it started raining and the first lightning flash showed up, the whole screen turned bright, like we were looking at an endless lightning bolt. For this test we used the Mr. Purple driver. In TimeSplitter's Future Perfect there's also the light occlusion issue, but overall the game runs well within what's possible. Overall, EmuCoreX is a functional emulator. It offers the ability to use graphics drivers, which can be interesting for Snapdragon Elite users, but for a user who normally doesn't have graphics driver issues, you'll have to keep testing until you find what works best for each game. The highlight is rendering Crash correctly in all of Gran Turismo 4's fonts, which can be a plus. On the other hand, the performance drop in other games can be frustrating, so I don't recommend it as your main emulator, but it can be used alongside another one. Third on our list is NetherSX2 Turnip. It's a NetherSX2 fork that only adds the ability to use Turnip drivers. If you're on a Snapdragon Gen 2 or older, you can skip this fork right away, because overall it's going to deliver a worse result than regular NetherSX2. But if you're on Snapdragon Gen 3 or Elite, it can be useful. The first setting a lot of people are going to look for is the ability to import your own drivers. But you don't need to worry about that, the drivers already come built into the emulator. First test, on Champion's Return to ARMS, the overall result is decent, everything renders correctly. Like I said before, this engine is problematic even on the original consoles, so expect small slowdowns because of heavy texture streaming. Always give preference to ROM revision 2.0, or you might get freezing when changing your character. Again, that's an issue with the game itself, not the emulation. Just like on the original NetherSX2, in Crash the Wrath of Cortex the fog was simply disabled, so there's no visual issue here, but it's a missing element. In God of War 2, the game also runs really well. The flat frame time gives the game really good smoothness, and it's an authentic experience that's currently recommended. The more serious issues start with Gran Turismo 4, where several game objects are missing. If you use the third-person camera, the entire track doesn't render, only the cars end up rendered. If you use the first-person camera, the track and cars render, but the rearview mirror is missing. In Need for Speed Underground 2 we had gameplay with no issues at all. And in TimeSplitter's Future Perfect the light occlusion also has issues. Overall, as you can see, the results are similar to NetherSX2's, but the custom driver can bring issues the base fork doesn't have, in case you don't own a device that requires a Turnip driver to run PS2 games. So, like I said, only use it if you have a more modern Snapdragon or an issue with the original Nether. And now we get to PSX2. This emulator, unlike everything mentioned so far, is a fork of ArmSX2. I'm not totally sure, but based on the interface that's what it looks like. If I'm wrong, correct me in the comments. As soon as this emulator came out, it was considered a scam. I'm not exactly sure what the issue was, so I'm not going to get into that here. This is another monetized emulator. It has a cost on the Play Store that varies by region, and it holds a rating of only 2 stars from users, with most reporting that the emulator simply doesn't work. I disagree, it does work, but it's really buggy, and you'll see that throughout the review. There's also the option to use Turnip drivers to improve performance or fix graphical issues, and the drivers can be switched in-game without needing to restart the emulator. I set the initial setup to run all the games at 3x, like the others, full HD resolution, but check this out, when running the game, the resolution showed up set as native. Even looking at the menu and seeing full HD, the game wasn't actually running like that. Selecting any other resolution and switching back to the one you wanted would usually save, but sometimes it crashed, and I had several crashes trying to change a resolution that was already set to normal. The on-screen stats also have this issue. Every time I restarted I had to turn them back on, and sometimes the emulator would freeze. Setting that aside for a bit, let's get into the game analysis. Starting with Champions Return to ARMS, unfortunately the game didn't pick up the global setting and I didn't notice, so we only got gameplay at native resolution. There are small performance dips, but like I said before, that's because of the texture streaming from the game's own programming. In Crash the Wrath of Cortex the fog renders correctly, and the gameplay is decent and smooth. In God of War 2 the problems start, with below expected performance. With the Turnip driver, the game runs at 40 FPS on average, and using the device's native driver, the FPS range between 13 and 15. It was the only emulator so far with below expected performance. In Gran Turismo 4, the game ran at 100% speed, and the lap split times and lap times were also rendered correctly. So at least here it had a bit of an edge over the NetherSX2 based emulators, for example. Need for Speed Underground 2 also had an issue. With the native driver, some objects flicker, but overall the speed is good. Since you can switch drivers in-game, I switched drivers and the issues were fixed. In TimeSplitter's Future Perfect I had so many performance issues. In the menu and in-game, that switching drivers didn't fix it, so I just gave up testing. Overall, being a fork of ArmSX2, a lot of menus don't save changes. The emulator breaks when changing essential settings that work fine in all the others, on top of the performance issues in several games. Charging for something this broken is almost embarrassing. Luckily I managed to get it for free through GitHub, but even so I don't think it's worth it. Before we get to our last project, don't forget to hit like, it gives me feedback on whether it's worth making Android exclusive videos. And if this is your first time on the channel, consider subscribing to keep up with more content. Lastly, ArmSX2. This was an unassuming fork, one that goes against what most of the other existing forks do. In forks like NetherSX2, the instructions are native PC instructions that then go through a recompiler for Android, meaning a PC to ARM recompiler is used. In ArmSX2's case, the code is already all developed in ARM, so it saves a processing step, which overall can boost performance, and even reduce the delay throughout the whole process. A few weeks ago I saw a video saying ArmSX2 had finally surpassed NetherSX2. Remembering how the result went the first time I tested this emulator, I had my doubts about that, especially considering how much content creators clickbait and exaggerate about content in general. But it's true, I wouldn't say it's ahead of NetherSX2, but it might already be pretty close, or almost catching up. Let's take a look together, and at the end tell me what you think. Champions Return to ARMS. At first it seems to only have an issue during texture streaming, but there seems to be a lot less issues in gameplay than on the Nether forks. But once we got to the boss, everything changed. The game hit slowdown, becoming unplayable. In Crash the Wrath of Cortex, the fog is present, and the gameplay is decent and smooth, nothing else to add. In God of War 2 we also had smooth gameplay, with no visual issues or performance drops, and it runs well overall. Gran Turismo 4 also runs decently, without the lap split or lap times, which also has issues on Nether. Need for Speed Underground 2 is where the issues really started. At first the game only reaches 20 FPS. The asphalt reflection flickers and is inconsistent. In some areas we could even keep the game at a steady 30 FPS. But as soon as you hit a spot with slightly higher hardware demand, the slowdown comes back. And only TimeSplitter's Future Perfect runs without the dreaded light occlusion issues. Comparing it directly to NetherSX2, Crash has the same performance, except Nether disabled the fog. Champions is unplayable on ArmSX2, God of War 2 runs well on both. Need for Speed Underground 2 was embarrassing on ArmSX2 and had the worst performance on the list. Gran Turismo also ties, and TimeSplitters runs better on ArmSX2. So saying this is the future of PS2 emulation on Android, at least for now, is an exaggeration. It's easy to see there are monthly improvements to the project, but calling it a solid project already is going to depend on how many games you have to test. Let's do a quick tier list before we wrap up, based on the experience I had testing these projects. Just a reminder, this is only my opinion, but I test a lot of stuff regularly, so I've got a decent basis for it. First, I removed the S tier. None of these emulators is S tier right now, they already do a lot, but they still need to improve. Starting in order, ArmSX2 really has been improving over time, and it has a nice interface, the best among all the projects tested, really intuitive. But a pretty interface doesn't do anything on its own in an emulator, and the overall performance ended up below expectations compared to the other projects. No point even trying to compare it to NetherSX2, which is still ahead. So it stays in B tier. EmuCoreX. I don't know where the idea came from to make this emulator right in a scene that's trying to grow, but between the monetization, the Turnip driver implementation, which in this case gets in the way more than it helps, and in the end below expected performance compared to what we already have out there, I'm putting it in C tier. NetherSX2 is that solid meat and potatoes option. It could improve, but it's basically the most compatible thing we've got today, and it's going to deliver decent performance in most cases. The dev is a guy who listens to and respects the community, is easy to reach, and does an incredible job modifying this project with basically no code at all. So it stays at the top of our list. NetherSX2 with Turnip support might be the holy grail for anyone with a more modern device, but based on the review done here, based on performance on my device, and considering it had an issue in Gran Turismo, it's going to stay in B. A good addition would be custom Turnip drivers. Lastly, PSX2. This emulator doesn't do anything right. The global settings are basically placebo. It's the only one that didn't implement controller vibration, and even though a handful of games run a bit better on it, it does everything worse than the others on this list. It stays in D tier. Do you guys agree with the list? What would your list look like? Let me know in the comments. As a bonus for anyone still here, I ran more tests with ArmSX2 on several other games. Let's see how it handles them. 007 from Russia with Love has slowdown even on PC, and on Android it wasn't any different. The game renders well, but it still carries the same slowdowns inherited from PSX2. 187 Ride or Die, a game from back when Ubisoft still knew how to make good games, also runs as expected, no issues. Ace Combat 4, which used to have a lot of graphical issues, now runs correctly, even beating out NetherSX2. Castlevania Curse of Darkness also runs as expected. Castlevania Lament of Innocence also has smooth gameplay and works the way it should. Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII, unlike NetherSX2, has fonts that render correctly here, but the gameplay still has slowdown. God Hand runs well, with no issues at all. Jack X Combat Racing is a problematic game, even on the original console, and it's the same on the emulator. Here it shows slowdown just like on NetherSX2, only really playable on PC. The King of Fighters Maximum Impact Regulation A runs well, with no issues at all. Midnight Club 3DB Edition runs with no slowdown or visual issues at all. Motorstorm Arctic Edge, another game with incredible graphics for the PlayStation 2, has slowdown during gameplay. Tekken 5 runs well, with no visual issues or slowdown. Urban Chaos becomes completely slow and unplayable. And before we wrap up, I'm going to give a shout out here to the channel members, who support and make it more enjoyable every day to spend my time producing for this channel. Thanks to all of you, and if you want to support this channel's content creation, consider becoming a member or subscribing to our Patreon, which besides having your name immortalized in the videos, also helps fund content creation and earns my gratitude. And that was the video. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.